We're delighted to welcome you to Session 2, Isolation. The discussion will be moderated by Steve Porter, Professor of Spiritual Formation and Theology at Biola University. Our guest panelists are Robert Loane, President of Vantage Point 3, and Liz Hall, Professor of Psychology at Biola University.
Well, Rob, Loane, and Liz Hall, thanks for joining in this conversation to help us think about community and how Christian community and the isolation of the conditions of COVID-19, how those have affected us interpersonally, relationally, in our friendships, in our family relationships, and in our church community. One of the theme verses or passages for this whole series is James 1. Consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And then James goes on to talk about endurance. And I always think it's important to mention there that when James says, consider it all joy, he's not saying, consider the trial the joy. It's not that the trial is something that we're joyful about. The trial, especially COVID-19, is horrific. And it's something that we're not joyful about in the least. But James is encouraging the church community of his time to be joyful about the results or the effects in our spiritual life, that conditions of challenge and of testing and of trial can produce endurance. And then again, the endurance here, the steadfastness, some translations have it, is not I can make it through this, but I can stay with God through this. It's an endurance of faith. It's an endurance of staying in a trusting and dependent posture with God, and in particular for our conversation, with God and with his people. And COVID-19 presented very unique circumstances in terms of social distancing and stay-at-home orders. And so we want to reflect on and not miss, what did we learn about living life in community, our need for community, our need for friendship, what the church is. So I think I'll just start there. And Liz, I'll start with you, and then Rob, you can address the same question. But just personally, Liz, how did COVID conditions disrupt or affect your own experience of Christian community? Were there opportunities there? Were there things that were losses or challenges? How did you experience those conditions?
Well, my church went through the circus that I think a lot of churches went through in terms of just trying to figure out on the fly how to first go completely online and then transitioning to holding services outside and then gradually transitioning to inside services. Within the church, my adult Sunday school class is my primary community. We've been sharing life together since our kids were very, very young. And so as soon as we were allowed to, actually fairly early in the pandemic, we started meeting weekly outside, socially distanced. And that really was a highlight of the week. I mean, it was really the only time in the week that I was with people outside of my family in person. The other thing that I think is both maybe a challenge and an opportunity is I think the pandemic served a kind of winnowing function in terms of our small group community, that there were people who left, right? I mean, there were people who decided that this was a time to just, abandon ship and maybe go elsewhere or stop attending. And so, of course, that was experienced as a loss. But the flip side of that was that there were definitely expressions of commitment on the part of the remaining people, people who are very steadfast, even more so than before the pandemic, in terms of showing up week after week, and that just overtly in ways that really were not very common before, expressed gratitude to the group and, expressions of deep appreciation for what the group gave to them. So, a bit of both.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Rob, how about you?
The year have made me much more aware of people I love and care for can see the world as a Jesus follower much differently, and in ways that I think are I don't agree with, and so there's been an element of, and this is just more the conversation I'm having with myself at this point, maybe my wife, maybe, of distrust that is just part of being in the same space and place now, that I didn't navigate as much as I saw them on a Zoom screen. Are these a bunch of generalities that I now have about these folks that I haven't even, there's a bit of an eggshell, but cared to reach out and know for sure, or project and assume that this set of people over there, of course, this is what's going on for them. And that's the hard work of, being much more particular and loving my neighbor in particular, rather than, despising them in general, and their views. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. And so that's a work of like, are you going to risk enough to reach out?
Yeah, find out maybe more of their story.
Right, rather than just Facebook being the arbiter of all realities, political and religious at this point. So
yeah. Since we're on this topic, I mean, Liz, what I have a hunch you have things to say about, dealing with division or alienation in relationships. What comes to mind kind of thinking about coming back into Christian community again with persons that we maybe feel some tensions with about their view of mask wearing or whatever it might be? How do you navigate that? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I've been thinking about it is, as we're coming back from COVID, I think there's a greater awareness of what we might call the fragility of community, right? Mm-hmm. Precisely for the issues that Rob was talking about, we realize how very, very different we are from people on some things that seem pretty important to us. Although when maybe we step back, they are not the essential elements of the gospel. They are the softer pieces that we are supposed to make not central to our relationships with others, right? And so what that requires of us then is to be in community with these people and to not just abandon our communities to try to find people that are more and more like us so that we end up contributing to the polarization that exists in our society, right? I mean, that's the antithesis of what we're supposed to be doing in Christian community, where we're supposed to be overcoming all of those barriers. It's not the Jew versus Greek anymore, but it might be the politically right versus the politically left, right? So these are the types of things that we need to be intentional about as we step into community again. And I think that we need to talk about process in our communities. So not just about the issues, but we need to talk about what does it mean to engage with each other when we disagree. We need to, reject the kinds of things that are modeled in larger secular culture in terms of the cancel culture and what in the psychological literature is called the affective polarization. In other words, thinking that people who think differently than us are bad people, right? So we need to learn what it means to have an opinion, to express that opinion in ways that are respectful of the other person, to learn to listen to their opinion and to try to find common ground, even if we don't agree on everything. And so those are things that are, I think, deeply biblical in terms of the ways that we're supposed to interact with each other. And I think that we need to actually teach people how to do that because they're certainly not picking up on those skills in what's modeled for them in the larger community. Loneliness isn't bad just because it's no fun to be lonely. It's also because it's very, very dangerous. I mean, research shows that it's as dangerous to your health than, it's more dangerous to your health than obesity, and it's about as deadly as smoking. So we're really talking about something that's very, very serious. And the other thing about loneliness is that it tends to be self-perpetuating. In other words, people who are lonely and are isolated, what seems to happen is that they end up losing kind of the ability to connect well with others. And so loneliness often sends people into kind of a downward spiral, and they need outside intervention in order to, reconnect with other people. And of course, this is where churches can play a really important role in terms of community. And it's not really something that we have been very good at. Usually churches have programs, they open it up for people to sign up for it, right? And then those of us who are socially inclined, sign up for this. And then we have these groups of people who are all, fairly well put together and that kind of thing. But of course, and I really do love that metaphor of going out to seek the one. I think that that's the mode that we need to get into, even if we only targeted the lonely people in our congregations, the people that just show up for Sunday, or who now may even just turn on their screens and view the service, from a distance. Those are the people that might need some intentionality in terms of bringing them in. I'm very aware that there are particular segments in our church of people that tend to be lonelier. There are always the people that are just more challenged in terms of their relational skills that are difficult to connect to, or that are just difficult overall, right? So those people tend to isolate because they don't attract people. They're difficult to get along with. Single people of all ages tend to have a hard time in our churches because so many of our activities are oriented toward families. And then, of course, widows. People in that older generation are often very, very lonely too. And so intentionality in terms of programs that are targeted at those people that are trying to serve their needs, I think, are very, very important.
That Jesus economy of the 99, leaving the 99 for the one, that resonates so deeply in so many of our hearts, begins to be a calling and an invitation. Yeah. So the Spirit's really creative, right, in disruptive times. And having walked through a number of disorienting, crucible sorts of experiences in my life, that is one sign of growth, that I begin to sit on my edge of my seat and wonder, what might Jesus do next here in this community of people, and how can I join in? And so when it comes to this sort of just the utter isolation, that even the highest functioning folks that you never think would have this going on for them.
I really think that in the body of Christ, every group of Christians, every smaller community within the church needs to have one or two or a handful of those people that they adopt and that they are intentional about caring for and including and working with in spite of their rough edges. That it's necessary not just for those people, but it's necessary for the kind of growth and character that we're all supposed to be gaining in the context of community.
As we return to in-person meeting in church life together, how do we come back together in a way that honors what we've been through, but also marks that we need one another, and to be more intentional about that? I've been a bit bothered in some sense, as much as it's so good to be back together doing the same liturgy that we always do. I've been a bit bugged that we're doing the same liturgy we always do, as if nothing happened in the last 16 months. And so I don't know if we need a new benediction that we speak over one another. But anyway, what ideas as we come back together, and that could be in the church setting, or even, family. I had a bit of a family reunion a week or so ago, and as near as I can remember, no one really said anything about COVID. It was good to be back together, but we didn't mark it. So any ideas about how to re-enter community in a way that marks and reminds us of what we've lost and of what we've been through together, and how to bring some of that into the present? Liz, do you have a thought about that?
I'm not sure that I have any good thoughts about it. And I am wondering too about how long we will need that kind of a marker. Do you know what I mean? I'm not sure. I think we want to learn things from our experience of the pandemic. I don't know that we want to incorporate the pandemic into our identity in some kind of central way, right? So there's a little bit of a balancing act there between those two things. The practice that you mentioned at the beginning of our time together, lament, might be kind of a marker, something that straddles both the old and the new, right? There are a number of churches that are experimenting with liturgies or even prayers of lament, or even reading some of the Psalms of Lament in more intentional ways. It might be that would serve as kind of a bridging function between the old and the new for a period of time, incorporating as it does both the sorrow and the grief over what happened, but also the praise and the expressions of trust. And so that might serve that kind of function that you're talking about here. Yeah.
Steve, what keeps on coming to my mind as we talk is so a little over a year ago, Alan Hirsch used a metaphor that has been very compelling in my way of imagining this. And he was talking about what ought we be doing, something like that. And this was late March, early April 2020. And the metaphor he talked about, he liked playing chess. And somewhere along the way, he began to take chess more seriously as a game. And so he began to ask people who were good at chess, what should he do to get better at chess? And someone told him that what he ought to do is, for the next few months, is just take the queen off the board. And the queen, the most powerful piece on the board. And in taking that off the board, you'll begin to realize that there's a lot more to the board. You've been overly dependent upon the queen. And so in April, he says, at some level, this is what has happened to us. For most local church community, almost every local church community, the Sunday morning worship service is the queen. And we try to and it's nothing's wrong with it at all. In fact, it's beautiful. It is, all those sorts of things. But what has happened to us is maybe we've been given an opportunity to see what the rest of the board can do.
Yeah. No, thank you guys. Let's turn to that practice question. Rob, I'm glad you reminded us of the Alan Hirsch metaphor, because I haven't thought about that for quite a while. And there is a sense that the queen is back on the board for a lot of people now, the weekly Sunday service. And I think exactly the question of practices and habits is the right one to ask, because I think we did learn how to use some of the other pieces on the board, but now that the queen's back, it's so easy to let other pieces kind of, go back to their unimportance. Just very practically, I in those early days of COVID, when about the only thing you could do with somebody is go for a walk outside 6 feet apart, I got into the practice of meeting with a few different friends one-on-one and going for walks in our neighborhoods 6 feet apart. And they were wonderful times. And now that we can go back to more or less life as it kind of was, I don't do those walks anymore. So here's the final question. We'll close with this, but it's hard to say what practices unless you have particular ideas in mind, but even just that, how do we take stock of what were some of the things perhaps we did well as individuals or as communities? Liz, you mentioned your small group meeting weekly early on. How do we not just slide back to the old way of doing things and forget some of these newfound practices that were really helpful and really needed? So any final reflections on that? And Liz, we'll start with you.
I wonder if I can get kind of geeky here for a minute, talk a bit about research, because one body of research that's been coming to mind as we've been talking here is the research done by anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who is at Oxford. And Dunbar is famous for figuring out that the size of the neocortex of certain mammals is related to the size of their social groups. In other words, we seem to be hardwired to be able to connect deeply with only a certain amount of people. As a particular kind of mammal. We would see it from a Christian perspective as God designed our brains in certain ways, right? Mm-hmm. And so he says that kind of the upper limit of people that we can be in some kind of relationship with is about 150. But his theory is even more interesting than that. He suggests that there are about 5 people in our lives that we can have deep, intimate connections with. People that we might be intentional about being in spiritual accountability with, for example. And then only about 15 people that we can rely on to have costly commitments to us, that we can reach out to when we are really in need, whether that be financial or emotional, and know that we can count on them. And so I think these kind of communities, like these concentric circles of 5 and 15 and 150, we really need to be thinking about this strategically in the context of our churches and setting up our churches so that people don't feel overextended, so that they are unable to form the kinds of deep relationships that they need to. But then also, especially in churches, most churches, I won't say most churches, a lot of churches these days are over 150 people, right? So making sure that people do have the ability to be in these kind of concentric circles. So it's a good way of thinking about how to set up the structuring of the church. It's helpful to know kind of what are the naturally occurring kind of boundaries of the types of relationships we can have that can help us be more intentional as we set up programs in our churches.
The Spirit has shown us that there's just this more relational way of life and ministry that he's inviting us into. And how do we reach out? And I don't mean that just as a get that off my chest because I need to do that, but to really create, and I can't do that to that many people, right? But to sort of commit to like, oh, that's something we're going to do. I can think of my wife and I, as we would think through that, this is something we're going to do this year. I don't know the exact form of it. So the bottom line, Steve, is the practice of spiritual conversations, which people long to have, but don't know how to get into them. And then companionship I would lump those under the practices that I would wish for leaders, that they would be spending a lot of time. How do we cultivate this sort of culture for that, even if that means paying less attention to the Sunday morning sometimes. But even for those of us that have ears to hear that the grand problems we're talking about do not have grand solutions, or the Lord is the one that handles those sorts of things. The Spirit's inviting us to a lot of small moves that are wise and loving and compassionate, and that is what might Jesus be doing in our midst. I think he might be up to some sort of things here, that these disruptions we might begin to imagine as within them invitations to a more relational way of life with God and with others.